Welcome back to Deck Building with Bahumaut. Today we're going to look at the Prowess ability, and we're going to see exactly how you can be offensive, defensive, and a spell slinger all in the one deck. So let's dive right in. Okay, for the core of this deck, we're going to look straight at the multicolored cards, and we'll see that there's a couple that are essential to creating a effective spell slinging speedy deck. So in our case, straight away you can see that all of these cards here are useful for prowess based gameplay. One of the quickest ones to start off with is Stormchaser Mage. Now, he doesn't exactly have the most inspiring stats, but 1/3 flyer for 2 mana, even if it is mixed, is pretty good. And he also has haste and prowess. Now, prowess is the crux of this deck, so whenever you play a spell, this creature will gain +1/+1 until end of turn, and of course if that's something like an instant or a buff spell, that can suddenly make him jump up in power massively. And same with most of the creatures that we're going to be putting in this deck. So a weak looking creature that gets blocked by something slightly stronger can completely annihilate it if you play a spell at the right time. Same with defenders. If you're defending with a smaller creature, suddenly it can jump up and become a massive wall. So this is a much more active deck than normal, in which the slow build-up would generally happen. We're going to be doing a lot more active gameplay with this deck than we would usually do. So chuck all 3 of those in there, straight away onto our next card. Now, because this is a spell slinging deck combined with prowess, this one is another build-up card that is essential in allowing you to draw more cards, because that's the other purpose of a lot of the cards in this deck, that they allow you to keep cards in your hand and just keep playing spells. Now, this is essentially what makes the deck completely unfair, especially in Two-Headed Giant. As you can see, at the beginning of each player's end step, that includes you and your opponent, that a player draws a card. If that player is your opponent, and if they have 4 or more cards in their hand, you can deal 2 damage to him or her or a planeswalker, even though it doesn't actually say that. So if you have 2 opponents, you can potentially be dishing out 4 damage per turn when their turn ends. And you can have 2 of these in your deck. And of course, at the same time, you're also increasing your own draw rate and replenishing your stock of spells to bombard your opponent. So definitely a good card to have with a deck like this. Now, another mixed card we have here is Brutal Expulsion. Now you might say, oh look, a 4 cost card for dealing 2 damage or boomeranging a creature doesn't seem like a good deal. But if you read the fine print, you can choose to use both abilities in the same spell. So you can boomerang and deal 2 damage by casting 1 single spell. And also, if you kill a creature with the 2 damage, it goes into exile. So it can be quite an effective turnaround, especially since your prowess abilities are all going to be triggered by it, and you can get rid of a defender, return a creature that's under threat to your hand, and also deal damage. So if you use this at the right time, it can be a game changer. Now we're going on straight onto our actual cards that we're the single color cards, I should say. So we'll start looking at red, And one card that gels very well with this is Pyre Hound. Now he's a little expensive for a 2/3 trample, but for every spell you play in this deck, he is going to get buffed. So think of him as a permanent prowess, which makes him essential for our needs. Moving on. Now, some of you might think, why haven't you put Pyromancer's Assault in here? Because you can see that dealing 2 damage for every second spell you cast could rack up fairly quickly. Well, the key thing with this is it has a high cost to get it out, and generally it's not worth it for dealing a potential of 2 extra damage per turn. So while it is a nice idea, the damage output just isn't enough to make it worthwhile. In my mind anyway. You might have more luck with it. You'll also see that this deck revolves around buff spells, especially those with trample. And one perfect example of this is Brute Strength. Think also on the fact that Prowess adds an additional 1/1. So if you use this on any Prowess creature in your deck, that's +4/+2 for 2 mana, and gives it trample. It can suddenly go from a small little attacker like a 1/3 to a massive 6/5. No, 5/5. Yes. With a 5/5 with trample suddenly appearing from a 1/3, for example, is a massive game changer. And especially if your opponent doesn't expect it. And of course, it's the same deal with Rush of Adrenaline, except it only adds +2/+1 instead of +3/+1. You also gain the trample effect in that one, so there's no real downside. Chuck more of them in. Now, we also need to include cards that do deal some damage, because sometimes you want to intercept a blocker or deter an attacking force. So we want to chuck a few of these in, because with the amount of spells we're going to be slinging, you'll reach spell mastery extremely quickly, and 3 damage for 1 mana instant is very good. It's very good value for mana. Now this is one of those real cards that can change the flow of a battle. And because our deck is so spell intensive, flipping Thing in the Ice is actually not that much of a big deal. Now, almost all of our creatures are extremely cheap to replay as well, because we're not playing big, tough, powerful creatures. We're making our creatures big, tough, and powerful from just casting spells. So, their actual initial cost is very low. So having all our creatures boomeranged isn't really as much of a downside to us as you would expect in a normal deck situation. So Thing in the Ice ability, now it's a 1 and blue mana defender for 0/4, which is quite nice. And it comes into play with 4 counters on it. Now every time you cast a spell, one of those counters is removed. Once all the counters are gone, it flips and becomes a 7/8 creature that boomerangs all other non-horror creatures to their owner's hand. And as I said before, our creature costs aren't that high, so that's not much of an inconvenience for us. But decks that revolve around big, expensive creatures can be completely dismantled by this. Also, the fact is, if you flip it just before an attack phase, they have no defenders on the field, and you get a free attack with a 7/8 creature. And since nearly all of our spells are instants, you can play just a little buff spell on it, or you can kill off one of the opposing creatures, or whatever you want. There's so many spells in this deck that it doesn't matter. And so that's a free 7 damage. I would only include 1 though, because you don't really need multiple of them in this deck. Although for those who want to make adjustments and want to consider making a horror-centric deck, so it doesn't actually boomerang your creatures, but will boomerang all your opponents, that might be an idea to consider. Now at this point you can see that we're severely down on creatures, so we need to find some prowess ones to add in. And in this case we've got Umara Entangler. So pretty simple creature, 2 mana for a 2/1, but it has prowess which suits our needs. So at least a couple of those in there. And another key one for this deck is Jhessian Thief. Yeah, 1/3 for 3 mana seems a bit expensive, but it has prowess, and the key thing for us is that whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you can draw a card. Now we're going to combine this together with Rogue's Passage so that it can bypass your opponent's defenses to continually give you a supply of cards. So definitely can be used as a blocker until you can bypass your opponent's defenses. Okay, so this deck will also still need a few cards that help us draw, and one of those that is really good for co-op or even just in single player, so two-headed giant or just regular play, is Comparative Analysis. Because our other spells are so cheap, we can actually reduce the cost. So we can play a single cost red spell, and pay the surge cost for 4 mana instead of paying the 4 mana outright. And of course that's triggering 2 spells, so you're having double the effectiveness of prowess while gaining 2 cards. So combinations like that can work fairly well during use of this deck. Now of course a deck like this wouldn't be complete without Jace, because as a planeswalker, of course, he gets some very nice abilities that sync with this deck. Draw a card. It just as a base, that's quite nice. He has a 2-cost boomerang, and of course, if you manage to get to his 8 ability, he just blanket counters the first spell that an opponent casts. So pretty much by the time you get to that point, the game's over. But if you want to really rub it in, having that emblem on the field is just such a nuisance to your opponent that they can't really do much. Now, you can also include Chandra, because her ability to summon low-cost creatures and attack with them is quite nice, but the main reason is her times X ability down the bottom there. Now, normally, when you're getting to that point in the game, if you're starting to be overwhelmed, you can trigger her times X ability and clear the board, especially before you trigger certain other effects. So you might want to boomerang your strong creatures and just wipe out everything else that's on the field. And timed right, this can be a life-saving ability. Now, an optional card that I like to include, even just to buff out the flying defense, but the main point of interest we have here is the second ability. This is the bonus ability. Whenever a source an opponent controls deals damage to you or a permanent you control, now this can be a creature, this can be while you're attacking, this can be any time, you can deal 1 damage to the source's controller. So this can add up extremely quickly, and as I said, it's a nice 4/4 flying attacker as well. While expensive, that ability can be quite devastating over time, so definitely worth considering. I generally like to put 1 in just to make things more interesting. One of the parts of the heart and soul of this deck you'll find is Soulblade Djinn. Now, most of the creatures in the deck already have prowess, which is all well and good. But Soulblade Djinn provides prowess that affects all creatures whenever it's triggered. So, play a spell, all your creatures will get +1/+1, and if those creatures also have prowess, they'll get their own +1/+1, so every spell can potentially add +2/+2 to all your creatures. So consider that as a sudden buff effect, and holy hell, can suddenly become a massive attacking army or a massive defending wall just from casting a single spell. And of course he's a nice 4/3 flyer as well. Well, a little pricey for that, but his ability more than makes up for it. So chuck both of those in, you're going to want them. And I like to include a couple of just the wings as both protection and defense. So as in protection for your creatures by boomeranging them in advance of a kill spell, or for boomeranging a big attacking creature so that it doesn't deal damage to you, or delaying your opponent. So chuck a couple of those in just to add a bit of flexibility to your deck. So moving on to lands, we're looking for Rogue's Passage to combine with our drawing extra cards. We can also look at Blighted Gorge. Now this is actually one of the few decks that having them in can pay off, because often you'll just end up late game with enough mana to be able to cover it. Chuck in our multi-lands of Sulfur Falls, and you could consider Westphal Abbey, but I probably wouldn't think it would be worth it. Even though your creatures are cheap, their prowess abilities can make them extremely deadly. So probably best to just leave it aside for this one. And flesh out the rest of our islands and mountains, and we are done. 60 cards. As you can see there, fairly good balance between the two colours. Nice curve there for the mana costs. And as I said, this is a heavy spell slinger deck, so as you can see, the spells outweigh creatures by about 6. And our lands are, as usual, around the 22 mark. Okay, our deck is all complete. So let's have a look at our star ratings and then see how we go. And of course, as you can see there, control is maxed out. Our synergy is quite high because of the number of prowess creatures we have in our deck. Our speed is fairly good because most of our spells are quite cheap. Now, that 1-star strength rating is very deceptive because the majority of our strength comes from triggering prowess abilities by using our spells. So if it was an actual real value, it would probably be around the 2-star or 2.5-star mark, and which should be more than enough to deal with most decks. So let's give it a try, shall we? Hopefully we'll be in for a good test. Okay, let's get started. So let's see what our opening hand is like. Okay. Alright, well, we're going to have to take this one. So, while we haven't started off with exactly the best scenario, it might give us a challenge and show us what this deck can really do. So, you always lead with a mountains, because there are no spells in the deck that are only a single island cost. So if you get the chance, always lead with a mountain. Still no real threats on the field, but as soon as we get a blue mana, we can start actually playing this game. There we go. Okay. So I might put out Thing in the Ice early just as the defender, even if I'm not going to trigger its ability, or at least intend to at this point. But already you can see I have a pair of instants in my hand that are quite cheap, so I could start whittling down its counters very quickly if I wished. And we'll keep pumping out creatures at this point. Now, that flyer with first strike we kind of want to get it out of the way early, so we may as well get rid of it. Before it can start doing chip damage to us. And another one, but that's alright, because this time we can attack with our 2/1 creature, which will presumably be blocked by the 2/2, because it will think that its first strike will protect it. And here's our first demonstration of prowess. So as you can see, 2/1 against a 2/2 first strike. Obviously we're stuffed, right? Well, luckily we have brute strength in hand, and it's our attack, so we're going to gain trample as well. And we also have our surge cost to reduce this spell, meaning we can play it as well to increase our attack strength. And already you can see our thing in the ice is down to a single token, a single counter. And we already have some extra draw cards in hand, so you can see how quickly this deck can turn around from being basically having no capability to fight to suddenly having the potential for massive damage. So it's an extremely deceptive deck, just from looking at the base strengths of creatures. Doesn't really tell you how effective this is. Now we have a 4/2 on the field. But one thing we should notice is that it's an actual horror. So triggering its triggering thing in the ice won't actually return it to its owner's hand. So we may as well play Fever Visions at this point, because it won't be affected by the flip. May as well attack with our 3/2. And what we can do is wait until our opponent's turn and cast Just the Wind on our horror friend on the other side. So we'll wait for the 4/2 to attack, trigger Just the Wind, which will flip Thing in the Ice, and leave them relatively exposed for their next attack. Because they'll have to pay it and pay the cost to play it and flip it again. Or they'll play a 2/2 first strike, another one. It's fine with us. And as I've stated before, our actual mana costs for our creatures are fairly low, so we can basically just keep playing them with impunity. And combine that with Brutal Expulsion. So we can return that, destroy that. So as you can already see, this deck is far more active than a normal deck. And generally, instead of sitting back and waiting, you're much better off going on the offensive and taking out as many creatures using your spell buffs as quickly as possible. And you also have several get out of screw up free cards with things like Thing in the Ice and it's like Thing in the Ice and Flameblade Angel, I think it was, which are just very good at dealing with blockades or stalemates. So as you can see there, they're bringing up more defense, which is once again fine with us. So now we can play our legendary Merfolk, which allows us to draw even more cards. Play Jhessian Thief as well, which gives us another card. And that's pretty much what we want. Brute Strength. And we can afford to attack with our 7/8 Horror because they can't deal enough damage to kill it, and all their mana is tapped. So it's essentially a free attack for us, and because they're on such low health, they're forced to defend. And since our health total is fairly high in comparison, we could just let them through, because the only one that'll be able to attack is the... I stand corrected. Both of them can attack, but we'll only take 6 damage from them unless they buff it. But if they do, they leave themselves wide open to an attack. Okay, so we're getting a few more options here. Chuck out more prowess creatures. Get more cards. And it's probably about time to end this thing, so all out attack. But I think we've had a fairly good demonstration of certain techniques and abilities that you can use with this deck. Now, the only one that's actually going to be a problem for us is the 3/3, which is going to kill our 2/3. Because our 1/3 will become a 2/4, our 7/8 is enough to kill the 4/2, so the only thing that can possibly die is the 2/3. So we're gonna buff that using Brute Strength, and finish this game. And keep in mind, buffing your ally in Two-Headed Giant will also trigger all your prowess effects on your side of the field, so it works extremely well. And that's a demonstration of how prowess works on the field. And it's one of the more entertaining abilities because you can be a lot more active and aggressive with this card, with this type of deck, than you would normally be. And you don't just have to sit back and try and build up an army to take down your opponent. You can trigger spell effects, draw extra cards, you can deal indirect damage with your enchantments or your Flameblade Angel. There's plenty of strategies within this one concept that allow you to take out your opponent. So hopefully that's opened your eyes a bit onto how well prowess can work. And that's it for deck building with Bahumaut today. This is Bahumaut signing out.